There is a wolf that has never met a human in its life. It wakes up at approximately the same time every day because its body tells it to, not because anything external is regulating its schedule. It finds its own food through a combination of cooperative pack hunting, scavenging, and the specific ecological intelligence that several years of survival in the wild have built into its behavioral repertoire. When it is sick, it finds specific plants to eat. When it is cold, it finds shelter. When it encounters danger, it makes its own risk assessment and acts on that assessment with the specific competence of an animal that has been solving its own problems since it was old enough to solve them. Its teeth are in excellent condition. Its joints are appropriate for its age. Its cardiovascular fitness is extraordinary. It will probably die of something external: conflict with another pack, an injury from a large prey animal, a particularly hard winter, rather than from the slow internal failures that characterize aging in most domestic animals. Now picture a dog. Not a hypothetical average dog, a specific dog that you either own or have encountered. A dog that cannot regulate its own food intake if given free access to it and will eat until it is medically compromised. A dog whose teeth require professional cleaning by a veterinarian, or they will develop periodontal disease. A dog whose breed-specific physical features, the flat face, the enormous head, the extremely short legs, the skin folds that trap moisture, are the products of human aesthetic preferences that the dog's own ancestral biology would never have produced. A dog that, in many cases, cannot reproduce without human assistance and cannot give birth without surgical intervention. A dog that experiences anxiety when left alone for 4 hours. This is the same animal. What happened between those 2 points, between the wolf and the dog, is one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of any species on Earth. And ancient humans started it. Not with any intention of producing the specific outcomes they produced, not with any understanding that the relationship they were beginning would, across thousands of generations, produce an animal that was simultaneously more connected to humans than any other creature on Earth and, in certain specific ways, significantly less capable of existing without them. This is the story of how ancient humans ruined dogs. Affectionately, accidentally, and with consequences that are still unfolding. Start with what wolves actually were before ancient humans started paying attention to them, because the baseline matters enormously for understanding what changed. The gray wolf, Canis lupus, the direct ancestor of all domestic dogs, is one of the most ecologically successful large predators that has ever existed. At its population peak, the gray wolf occupied a geographic range extending across virtually the entire northern hemisphere: Europe, Asia, North America, with regional variations in size and behavior, but with the same fundamental behavioral architecture across the entire range. That behavioral architecture was sophisticated. Wolf social organization involved complex hierarchical relationships within packs, cooperative hunting strategies requiring coordination across multiple individuals, territorial management across large geographic ranges, and the kind of sophisticated communication system, vocalizations, body posture, scent marking, facial expression, that allowed a pack to function as a coordinated social unit. Wolves were cognitively capable in ways that supported this sophistication, theory of mind capability allowing them to model the intentions and attention of other individuals. Spatial memory sufficient to navigate home ranges covering hundreds of square kilometers, flexible problem-solving ability that allowed individuals to learn from experience and adjust strategies in response to novel challenges. And wolves were, by every physical and physiological measure, superbly adapted to their environment. Their dentition was optimized for the mechanical demands of capturing and processing large prey. Their musculoskeletal system was optimized for sustained pursuit over varied terrain. Their gastrointestinal physiology was optimized for processing meat efficiently. Every physical feature was the product of millions of years of selection for survival and reproductive success in specific ecological conditions. This is what ancient humans started working with. This is the raw material. The first thing ancient humans did to wolves, without knowing they were doing it, was select against the specific behavioral traits most essential for wolf survival in the wild. The wolves that began associating with ancient human camps were not representative samples of wolf behavioral diversity. They were the specific individuals at one end of a behavioral spectrum, the least reactive, least fearful, most tolerant of human proximity. In wolf population terms, these were the behavioral outliers. The individuals whose stress response to human presence was calibrated at the low end of the distribution. In the wild wolf population as a whole, this low-stress reactivity to human proximity was probably mildly disadvantageous. Wolves that were appropriately fearful of humans avoided the specific dangers that human proximity involved. The organized human response to wolf threat, the weapons, the specific aggression that humans deployed against wolves who came too close to their camps or their food. The wolves with appropriate human wariness survived longer in conditions where human-wolf conflict was a mortality risk. But the wolves that chose the camp periphery, that were willing to trade appropriate human wariness for access to the caloric resources that human camps provided, were in a different selection environment. In the camp periphery environment, human wariness was not an advantage. The ability to tolerate human proximity without triggering a flight response was the advantage. Each generation of camp peripheral wolves selected more strongly for this specific trait. What ancient humans were inadvertently selecting against was the fundamental wolf capacity for autonomous existence in a world defined by constant risk assessment. The wolves that were best at surviving around humans were the wolves that were worst at one of the most essential wolf capabilities: maintaining appropriate vigilance about the apex predator in their landscape. The behavioral consequences of this selection accumulated across generations in ways that went far beyond simple reduced human wariness. The specific hormonal architecture associated with high-stress reactivity in wolves, elevated baseline cortisol, strong adrenal response to novel stimuli, the specific neuroendocrine profile of an animal living in a high vigilance state, was being selected against in the camp peripheral population. The selected for profile was lower baseline cortisol, reduced adrenal reactivity, and the specific calm that characterizes individuals who are not constantly operating in a state of heightened environmental assessment. This neuroendocrine shift had downstream consequences that ancient humans almost certainly did not anticipate and would not have been able to predict. Lower cortisol and reduced stress reactivity are associated with extended retention of juvenile behavioral characteristics, the phenomenon called neoteny, in which adult individuals retain behavioral and physical traits that characterize juveniles in the ancestral population. In wolves, juvenile behavioral traits include higher play drive, reduced aggression toward novel individuals, more frequent vocalization, greater social flexibility, reduced territorial rigidity, and, critically, stronger orientation toward social partners for behavioral guidance rather than independent decision-making. Wolf pups look to adults for behavioral cues in uncertain situations. Adult wolves rely primarily on their own assessment. The proto-dogs that ancient humans were inadvertently producing were, neurochemically speaking, animals that were retaining extended juvenile behavioral characteristics into adulthood. They were, in a specific biological sense, adult animals behaving more like wolf pups, more playful, more socially flexible, more oriented to others for behavioral guidance, less independent in their behavioral decision-making. This was the foundation of the dog, and it was a foundation built from the systematic reduction of the specific behavioral traits that made wolves competent wild animals. Now address what deliberate ancient human management added to this process, because the inadvertent selection of the camp periphery phase was only the beginning. As the relationship between ancient humans and proto-dogs deepened, as specific animals formed, specific bonds with specific human individuals, as those animals began traveling with human groups rather than simply exploiting the periphery of human camps. Ancient humans began making active choices about which animals to maintain close relationships with and which to exclude. These choices were not systematic selective breeding in any modern sense. Ancient humans had no concept of genetics, no understanding of heredity, no formal breeding program. What they had was the same behavioral preferences that any person who lives closely with animals develops. Preferences for the individual animals whose behavioral profile made them most useful, most pleasant, and most compatible with the specific conditions of ancient community life. An ancient hunting group that found that certain proto-dogs were more attentive to hunter behavioral cues, more responsive to redirection, more willing to coordinate their behavior with human activity. That group naturally maintained closer relationships with those animals, fed them more, protected them more, and allowed them to reproduce in closer association with the human community. The specific behavioral traits those individuals possessed were passed to their offspring in higher proportions than the traits of animals less compatible with human activity. The selection for attentiveness to human behavioral cues had a specific consequence that was profound. It began selecting for the specific capacity to read human communicative signals. Dogs are the only non-human animal species that spontaneously, without training, follows the human pointing gesture. Understanding that a human pointing at something is directing attention to that thing rather than simply making a hand movement. This capability does not appear in wolves. It does not appear in chimpanzees, our closest genetic relatives, without extensive training. Dogs do it spontaneously, even as puppies with no prior human experience. This is an extraordinary cognitive capability that was selected for in the dog lineage specifically because of ancient human selection for responsiveness to human communication. Ancient humans, through thousands of years of maintaining closer relationships with the most attentive, most responsive proto-dogs, selected for a specific cognitive adaptation to human communicative behavior that has no parallel in the animal world. The dog's capacity to understand humans had increased dramatically. Their capacity to understand anything else had correspondingly reduced investment. Here is where the story takes the turn that the title implies, because the selection processes that were producing dogs with extraordinary human compatibility were simultaneously producing animals with specific deficits that their wolf ancestors did not have. The wolf that is independent, self-directing, capable of sustained autonomous problem-solving in a complex environment, these characteristics were being selected against as strongly as human orientation was being selected for. Every generation of selection for reduced independence, for increased orientation to human behavioral guidance, for greater reliance on human social cues for behavioral direction was simultaneously selecting against the specific cognitive and behavioral autonomy that wolves used to survive in the wild. The dogs that were best at being dogs, most attuned to human communication, most oriented toward human social feedback, most dependent on human behavioral guidance, were the worst at being wolves. The selection pressures had been, from the wolf's eye view, systematically destructive. Everything that made a good wild canid had been progressively traded for everything that made a good human companion. This is the ruination the title describes. Ancient humans did not set out to ruin dogs. They set out, in the most immediate and practical sense, to have useful animal companions who were good at specific tasks and pleasant to be around. The byproduct of this entirely reasonable objective was an animal that had been progressively optimized for human compatibility at the cost of autonomous viability. A dog released into the wild, most dog breeds, under most conditions, cannot survive independently for long. Not because it lacks the physical capability in some cases, but because it lacks the behavioral and motivational architecture for sustained autonomous existence. It does not know how to be appropriately cautious of humans. It does not have the specific combination of autonomous decision-making, sustained vigilance, and ecological intelligence that wild survival requires. It has been selected out of those capabilities across thousands of years of human management. The physical dimension of what ancient and subsequent human selection did to dogs deserves direct examination because the behavioral changes were accompanied by physical changes that are equally remarkable. The earliest domestic dogs, the proto-dogs of the ancient period, were not dramatically different physically from the wolves they descended from. Size differences were modest. Skull proportions were somewhat modified, consistent with the neotenic shift toward juvenile characteristics. Coat color variation began appearing as color markings that were disadvantageous in a wild camouflage context were no longer selected against. But the physical diversification accelerated dramatically as human selection intensified, and as different human communities selected for different functional traits. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Dogs bred for specific hunting purposes developed different body proportions than dogs bred for herding, which developed differently from dogs bred for guarding, which developed differently from dogs bred for companionship. The extraordinary physical diversity of modern dog breeds, from the Chihuahua to the Great Dane, whose body mass differs by a factor of approximately 100, is the product of human selection operating on the fundamental developmental architecture that ancient humans first modified. Some of this physical diversification produced animals that were better at specific tasks than any wolf could have been. Sighthounds, whose long legs and deep chest produced running capability exceeding wolf running capability. Scent hounds, whose olfactory system had been further refined through selection. Herding breeds whose behavioral repertoire for managing livestock exceeded anything in the wolf behavioral library. But some of this physical diversification produced something quite different. Animals whose physical characteristics were incompatible with the demands that those same characteristics would face in a wild context. Flat-faced breeds whose shortened skull produces chronic respiratory compromise. Giant breeds whose size creates cardiovascular stress and joint problems. Double-coated breeds whose coat requires human management to prevent matting that would be debilitating in a non-managed context. Ancient humans started this process. They started it by preferring animals that looked and behaved in ways that humans found pleasant, useful, or aesthetically satisfying, without reference to what those preferences were doing to the animal's capacity for autonomous function. The consequences compound across thousands of years. Here is the cognitive dimension that is perhaps the most profound aspect of what ancient humans produced in dogs, and the one that is most often overlooked. The dog's extraordinary capacity to read and respond to human social signals, the capability that makes dogs so useful and so companionable, is accompanied by a specific deficit in the domain where wolves excel: reading and responding to the environment as an autonomous agent. Wolves solve novel problems independently. They assess their own behavioral options, integrate information from their environment, and execute behavioral strategies without reference to any external social authority. This autonomous problem-solving is the cognitive foundation of wild survival. Dogs tested in the same novel problem-solving contexts show a striking different response pattern. When faced with an unsolvable problem, dogs rapidly shift from independent problem-solving attempts to looking at humans, seeking human behavioral guidance rather than continuing to assess independent solutions. This human referencing behavior is so automatic and so rapid that it interrupts problem-solving attempts that the dog was actively pursuing moments before. This is not a failure of dog intelligence. Dogs are cognitively sophisticated animals. This is a specific adaptation, the most thorough, most systematic social learning orientation toward a specific partner species that has ever been produced by natural or artificial selection in any animal. The dog has been selected to treat human behavioral guidance as the primary resource for navigating uncertainty, more reliable and more immediately accessible than its own autonomous. Environmental assessment. Ancient humans produced this. They produced it by consistently, across thousands of years, maintaining closer relationships with animals that looked to them more, and less close relationships with animals that looked to them less. The accumulated selection pressure of thousands of years of human preference for human-oriented dogs produced an animal whose primary cognitive orientation toward uncertainty is not environmental assessment, but human seeking. That is extraordinary. It is also, from a specific perspective, a form of cognitive dependency that wolf ancestors were entirely free of. Here is the full picture of what ancient humans actually did. They took the most cognitively sophisticated, physically capable, behaviorally flexible large predator in the northern hemisphere And across thousands of years of inadvertent and then deliberate selection, produced an animal that was better at reading human faces than any other species on Earth, could not reliably survive without human management in most environmental contexts, had traded autonomous problem solving orientation for human seeking behavior, and, in the extreme cases of heavily selected breed lines, had physical features that required ongoing human veterinary intervention to manage. They also produced the most successful large mammal domestication in history. Dogs are present on every inhabited continent. They number in the hundreds of millions. They perform functional roles ranging from assistance for disabled individuals to cancer detection to search and rescue. The relationship they have with humans is the deepest, most neurochemically bilateral, most mutually elaborated interspecies bond that has ever existed on this planet. Both of these things are simultaneously true. The ruination and the extraordinary success are not opposites. They are two dimensions of the same transformation. The systematic optimization of one species for compatibility with another, producing both the incomparable partnership and the specific costs that optimization at the expense of autonomous viability always produces. Ancient humans did not know what they were doing. They were following preferences that made immediate sense for calm animals, for responsive animals, for animals that worked well with human groups, for animals that were pleasant to be around. The long-term consequences of those preferences operating across thousands of years of selection were not foreseeable in any specific generation. But the wolf that is sitting across the clearing, watching the camp without approaching, managing its own existence with the full competence of a species optimized for autonomous survival, that wolf is looking at its own descendants. And what it sees across the fire, curled against a human who is scratching its ears in exactly the spot it likes best, is something simultaneously diminished and transformed into something entirely new. Ancient humans ruined wolves into dogs, and dogs, given the choice, would not change a thing.